Okay, let's get into this. We often talk about the Enlightenment as the birthplace of social science, the systematic study of human behavior, politics, society.
Sure, Montesquieu, Comte, that whole era.
Exactly. But what if I told you the blueprint was drawn up, really drawn up, centuries earlier, far from Renaissance Europe, by a scholar diplomat whose life was basically a real-time laboratory for political failure?
And that's precisely where we are today. Our subject is Abd al-Rahman ibn Khaldun, a figure who is, and this is no exaggeration, a titan of intellectual history.
We're doing a deep dive into the foundational volume of his massive history, Tarikh ibn Khaldun. But really, we're focusing on its extraordinary self-contained introduction.
The Muqaddimah.
The Muqaddimah. Our listener has provided this dense, honestly revolutionary text, and our mission is to cut through the centuries and the philosophical weight. This is not just a standard history book.
Not even close.
If you just glance at the table of contents, it spans the philosophy of history, geography, economics, politics, anthropology. He even critiques nearly every known science of the 14th century.
It's a total intellectual panorama.
Yeah.
And our goal here is to quickly but thoroughly synthesize Khaldun's core insights. We need to understand his revolutionary framework for studying civilization, which he called Ilm al-Umran.
Right.
And then extract the iron laws he claimed govern how societies are organized, how power is established through this concept of Asabia, and why all civilizations are destined to rise and, more importantly, fall in these predictable cycles. He didn't just write history. He explained how history works.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me, because to understand the theory, you absolutely have to understand the man. Let's start there with the context that forged this genius.
Absolutely. Ibn Khaldun's life story is less about quiet, scholarly contemplation and more about the relentless, high-stakes chaos of 14th century North Africa and Andalusia.
So his full name was Abd al-Rahman ibn Khaldun, born in Tunis in 1332.
Yes, into a very distinguished Arab family, the Banu Khaldun. They traced their lineage back to the Arabs who had conquered Spain and later had to migrate from Seville.
So he inherits this legacy of, prestige, but he's born into a world defined by fragmentation. The sources really stress this context of intense political turbulence in the Maghreb.
Oh, absolutely. The world he inhabited was politically shattered. You had these constantly shifting petty kingdoms and rival dynasties, the Marinids, the Zayanids, the Hafsids, all just constantly vying for control.
Not exactly a stable environment.
It was a perpetual state of intrigue and war. And Khaldun, who was trained in law, theology, and philosophy, he didn't choose the life of an academic recluse. He dove right into the fire as a diplomat, a secretary, an advisor.
And his career path, it reads like a total cautionary tale about political ambition. He served rulers in Morocco, specifically Fez, then Granada in Spain, Tlemcen, all these different ports. This was a brutal education in power, wasn't it?
It was the ultimate cynical education. Serving a ruler meant constant exposure to plots, espionage, betrayal. Khaldun himself spent significant time in prison.
For what?
For suspected involvement in a conspiracy back in Fez. And he was constantly making these forced shifts in allegiance just to survive. This wasn't abstract political theory for him. This was realpolitik. Survival.
It must have been that constant exposure to the absolute worst of human nature and governance that shaped his analytical mind. It gives his work this really keen, almost cold, analytical edge.
Exactly. He wasn't sitting around discussing what an ideal state should be.
Yeah.
He was detailing the mechanisms of the state as it actually functioned in all its messy reality.
He saw firsthand that ideals just crumble into self-interest and raw force.
Precisely. His experience showed him that political power wasn't based on abstract morality. It was based on observable social forces, military strength, and economic vitality.
Yeah.
He learned that everyone, even sultans, were subject to the laws of society.
Which brings us to the moment of creation. After decades of this high-wire political act, he finally steps back. Tell us about the retreat that led to the Muqaddimah.
Well, by 1374, Khaldun was just utterly weary of the instability and the treacherous nature of court politics. He sought asylum and retired to a place called Khalat ibn Salama, a castle near modern-day Tiret in Algeria.
And he stayed there for about 4 years.
Roughly 4 years, yes. And his original plan was to write this monumental universal history, the Kitab al-Ibar, the Book of Lessons, focusing on the history of the Arabs and Berbers.
But the moment he started writing, he realized the existing historical methods were, for lack of a better word, garbage. They were just lists of events.
He hit a fundamental problem. How could he possibly verify the truth of the thousands of historical accounts he was working with? He knew from his own court experience that these narratives were riddled with exaggerations, flattery, contradictions. He couldn't just catalog them.
He needed a filter.
He needed a revolutionary methodological framework to judge historical truth.
So, the Muqaddimah, which means the introduction, or prolegomena, was born out of this sudden, powerful, intellectual necessity. It wasn't even meant to be the main work.
No, it was meant to be the scientific scaffolding for the main work.
That's incredible.
It was conceived and largely drafted between 1374 and 1377. It established the laws of human social organization, his Ilm al-Umran, so that he could determine what was sociologically possible and what was impossible in historical accounts. He quickly realized that the framework itself, the Muqaddimah, was arguably more important than the history it was supposed to introduce.
And after he finishes the first draft, he eventually moves to Cairo in 1382.
Right. Cairo, under the Mamluks, was the undisputed intellectual and cultural capital of the Islamic world. It offered him a stability and patronage that the Maghreb just couldn't. He spent the rest of his life there, teaching and serving several terms as the chief Maliki judge.
And that stability allowed him to keep refining the Muqaddimah. But the political drama wasn't quite over, was it? The sources always highlight this one dramatic, real-world application of his theory.
The encounter with Timur. Tamerlane.
Yes! This is one of the greatest historical mic drop moments ever recorded. It's 1401. Tamerlane, the terrifying Mongol conqueror, is besieging Damascus. Khaldun is in the city at the time.
And he's part of a delegation sent out to negotiate with Timur. But then the Sultan of Egypt flees, leaving the delegation, including Khaldun, completely stranded outside the city walls.
An impossible situation.
But Khaldun, showing immense political courage and using his intellectual leverage, requests and secures an audience with Timur. And instead of groveling, he uses the knowledge he'd refined in that castle retreat to survive.
So what did he do? He didn't just flatter him?
No. Khaldun used his understanding of Asabia and the political cycles of nomadic groups, the very things he wrote about, to give Timur this deep, chillingly accurate geopolitical assessment of all the various Arab, Berber, and Turkish groups that Timur would encounter in North Africa.
He's basically giving the conqueror a roadmap.
He's giving him a detailed genealogy and analysis of their strengths and weaknesses. He was using his academic work as a diplomatic tool, proving the practical value of Ilm al-Umran right to the face of the most powerful man in the world.
And Timur was impressed.
So impressed that he kept Khaldun near him for over a month. He survived the sack of Damascus and returned to Cairo. He died in 1406, his framework proven in the crucible of a real political crisis.
So his life ends in Cairo, a respected scholar. But when does the rest of the world truly recognize him as the father of sociology?
Well, in the Islamic world, his influence was steady, though often more in historical circles. But the great leap to global recognition happened much, much later. We're talking the mid-19th century, through the colossal efforts of Baron William McGuckin Deslaine.
The French translation.
Yes, Deslaine's French edition was pivotal. It allowed European historians and sociologists to finally access his theories. And that access was solidified for the English-speaking world in 1958 with Franz Rosenthal's magnificent 3-volume English translation.
And Rosenthal's work is what made him globally accessible, what solidified his reputation. People often say he's one of the first, if not the first, true sociologist.
He basically invented the field. He saw patterns in the chaos of his own life and codified them into a science, proving that human organization, for all its variability, obeys fundamental laws, just like physics or astronomy.
Okay, so let's transition into that intellectual revolution itself. He's writing this universal history, but he fundamentally distrusts his own source material. What was his basic critique of history writing up to that point?
Khaldun saw history as being in a state of intellectual crisis. His critique was devastatingly precise. He attacked historians who were essentially just copyists,
Right.
writers who recorded narratives without subjecting them to any kind of intellectual scrutiny, critical analysis, or rational testing.
He felt they were failing on two levels. One, they were just accepting fables, and two, they failed to understand the context of the events.
Exactly. He pointed out several specific errors. First, flattery and partisanship. Historians would exaggerate the virtues of rulers or accept tales designed to flatter the ruling dynasty.
Of course.
Second, an uncritical acceptance of numerical data, especially about armies or wealth. This led to absurd exaggerations, like armies numbering hundreds of thousands when the logistics of the time made that utterly impossible.
So the goal of history had to change. It couldn't just be a chronicle of events.
Khaldun argued that the true goal of history, or tariq, isn't the outward appearance of events, the stories, but the inner truth. The systematic examination of the causes, the origins, the reasons behind events.
It's about investigating the underlying nature of civilization, Umran
Yeah.
itself.
Analyzing the specific social and economic circumstances that make certain events possible or impossible.
Now, in his world, religious history was paramount. How did he balance the truth found in Scripture with his demand for this kind of rational social analysis?
That's a great question. He was a devout Muslim scholar, so he didn't reject the Quran or prophetic traditions as sources of historical knowledge. He maintained the divine wisdom guides creation and human affairs.
What?
But he emphasized that those sources provide the theological framework, the application and interpretation of human events, the messy reality of wars, political shifts, economic decline. All that must be subject to rational social analysis.
So, the divine provides the ultimate truth, but Ilm al-Umran provides the necessary tool for verifying the human record of events.
Precisely. He was applying rigorous logic to the human elements of historical transmission. The divine reality stands, but when someone claims an army marched for 40 days without supplies, we have to apply the laws of logistics, society, and economics to determine if that human report is even plausible.
Which brings us to the core term, Ilm al-Umran, the science of civilization. Let's define Umran first.
Umran is often translated as civilization, social organization, or settlement. Khaldun posits that it is the fundamentally necessary gathering of human beings. He bases this on a principle, insan madani ul tabi.
Man is social by nature.
Man is social by nature. Humans simply cannot survive alone.
That sounds almost Aristotelian, but Khaldun immediately links it to these very practical survival necessities.
Yes, the necessity of Umran comes from a few inescapable facts. First, defense. Humans need protection against wild animals, and more critically, against each other due to inherent aggression.
And second, livelihood.
Livelihood. Cooperation is essential for securing food, especially through agriculture, and developing specialized crafts. Umran is simply the spontaneous, inevitable, and indispensable result of basic human needs.
So if Umran is the subject, the social organization, then Ilm al-Umran is the new field of study he's creating for it. How is it unique?
It's unique because it stands apart from traditional history, which he saw as too descriptive, and traditional philosophy, which he saw as too abstract and idealistic. Ilm al-Umran is dedicated to observing and codifying the immutable laws of human social life.
So politics, economics, urban versus rural life.
All of it. And the customs that govern how it all transforms. It's empirical sociology applied directly to the historical record.
This scientific approach requires a radically new methodology for historians. If the trustworthiness of the narrator isn't enough, what is the ultimate standard for verifying a historical account?
The ultimate standard is the natural law of society. Khaldun's methodology dictates that historical accounts must be judged against their internal coherence and the inherent possibility dictated by the natural laws of civilization.
So you use reason and establish sociological facts about armies, economics, and human nature to screen the report.
You do. He frequently uses it to debunk wildly inflated historical numbers. For instance, reports claiming a certain dynasty fielded an army of 400,000 men during the early Islamic period.
An impossible number.
He takes that claim and immediately filters it through Ilm al-Umran. He asks, what is the economic base required to fund, equip, and feed 400,000 men? How much agricultural surplus would that require? How large was the population base? Given the state of taxation and currency flows of that era, he demonstrates it's a logistical and economic impossibility.
So it doesn't matter who said it. It just couldn't have happened.
Right. He's saying the laws of population density, agricultural output, and administrative capacity preclude this event from ever happening. He transformed history from a passive recording exercise into a critical, analytical one.
It's a revolutionary leap from trusting sources to trusting verifiable sociological patterns.
It is.
And this foundation of Ilm al-Umran allows him to dissect the engine of power. And that engine, in his view, is exclusively fueled by one thing: Asabia. This is the central concept of the Muqaddimah, isn't it? Let's define it carefully.
It is the absolute core. Asabia is notoriously difficult to translate with a single English word. But we can get at it with phrases like group solidarity, social cohesion, or kinship bond.
A kind of collective spirit.
A fierce collective spirit, a powerful, deep-seated sense of shared identity and mutual obligation, usually rooted in blood ties or shared hardship, that binds a group together for mutual defense and, crucially, for political ambition.
It sounds like the necessary ingredient for raising a state from scratch.
It is the fundamental driving force for conquest and establishment. Without strong Asabia, a group cannot withstand hardship, endure military challenges, or raise itself above other factions to claim authority. It's the raw energy of political power.
And Khaldun links the intensity of this asabiya directly to the environment, making this contrast between two major lifestyles.
Yes, the famous distinction between Badawi life and Hadari life. Badawi refers to rural, nomadic, or desert life. Life characterized by simplicity, hardship, and necessity.
Where you have to rely on the group to survive.
Exactly. That intense pressure cooker naturally forges the strongest possible asabiya. This group tends to be more courageous, spirited, and unified.
And the inevitable result of success conquering territory is the transition to Hadari life.
Right. Hadari refers to urban, settled, sophisticated, and luxurious civilization. The security and comforts of city life weaken the asabiya. Protection is now provided by paid police and walls, not by your kin. Livelihood is easy. Luxury, specialized crafts, and ease of living lead to moral softening.
And a reliance on the state. It dissolves that sharp defensive edge of the group.
The very success of a state carries the seeds of its eventual defeat. The tough, unified Badawi conquer the soft, fragmented Hadari, and then they, in turn, become Hadari.
It's the cycle of political entropy. The strength of the state is proportional to the strength of its asabiya, and that strength is always finite. It's eroded by the very prosperity it creates.
That's the tragic irony at the heart of a system.
But before we get to the full cycle of decline, Khaldun has to establish the necessity of the state itself. Why must humans, who are naturally social, also require a ruler?
This goes back to his observation of human nature. While humans are social, they also possess inherent aggressive and selfish tendencies. If left unchecked, they will constantly commit aggression against one another, which leads to chaos and the collapse of the cooperation needed for livelihood.
So a state, even a coercive one, is a necessary precondition for civilization.
It's the minimum requirement for Umran to sustain itself, and from there, he draws his famous distinction between the ideal and the practical forms of rule.
The ideal being the caliphate, or khilafat.
Which he defines as rule based on Sharia law, necessary to protect both the temporal interests of the community and its religious interests. It's government based on justice, consensus, divine mandate. But this form can only thrive when the original Asabiyya is still strong and religiously inspired.
But the political realist in him quickly notes that this is rare and temporary.
He argues that the caliphate naturally and inevitably degenerates into monarchy or mulk. This is rule based purely on political power, force, and the ruler's self-interest, the establishment of hereditary coercive authority.
And he uses the historical transition from the four rightly guided caliphs to the Umayyad dynasty as his proof.
As the definitive proof point, yes. The ideal is fleeting. The pragmatic coercive monarchy is the default setting for civilization.
Which brings us to the heart of his predictive sociology, the 5 stages of a dynasty. These are the sociological laws that doom every successful state.
And this cycle provides the framework for his entire history. He insists this isn't fate, it's a sociological law governing institutional life.
Okay, stage 1, establishment and conquest.
This is the revolutionary phase. The state is driven by its peak, often religiously charged Asabiyya. They are still Badawi and spirit unified, hardened by necessity. They conquer territory, eliminate all rivals, and establish the foundational institutions of the new state.
And the cost of governance is low.
Very low, because loyalty is based on kinship, not payroll.
Then comes stage 2, consolidation and monopolization.
The ruler now fears the very force that raised him to power, his own tribal Asabiyya. He has to transition from being a first among equals to an absolute monarch.
So he starts pushing out the old guard.
He monopolizes power. He pushes out old tribal leaders and kinsmen, replacing them with loyal servants, clients, or mercenaries who owe their allegiance solely to him and the treasury. The state begins to rely less on kinship and more on money and institutional force.
And that shift seems like the dynasty's first major sociological wound. He sacrifices the group spirit for his own personal security.
Exactly. The ruler secures his family's position, but he begins the process of dissolving the social cohesion that created the state. He begins paying for loyalty, which brings us to stage 3.
Stage 3, affluence, leisure, and tax maximization.
This is the peak prosperity period, often lasting a couple generations. The dynasty has secured its borders, and the ruler focuses entirely on acquiring wealth, maximizing taxes, and indulging in status projects.
Building grand cities, monuments, massive palaces, maintaining an extravagant court.
all for prestige and personal satisfaction. State expenditure increases dramatically, far beyond what was ever necessary in stage one. And this luxury inevitably brings on the Hadari characteristics, softness, and ethical decline.
The population loses its martial spirit.
Completely. And Khaldun stresses that the vast expenditures in this stage are necessary to maintain prestige and the enormous bureaucracy and army, but they drain the treasury and strain the economy, preparing the groundwork for the coming crisis.
Then we get to stage 4, contentment, stagnation, and conservatism.
The dynamic energy of the founding generation is completely gone. The rulers and administrators are just mimicking the policies of their predecessors. There's no innovation, no spirit of reform, and deep corruption sets in.
The populace is deeply Hadari by now.
Yes, and critically, Khaldun notes that the Asabia of the original group is now fully depleted. The military has to consist almost entirely of expensive sworn mercenaries or slaves, because the original population lacks the motivation or skill to fight. The state's vulnerability is total, even if it looks powerful on the outside.
Which leads, inevitably, to stage 5. Dissolution and decadence.
The collapse. The moral decay is pervasive. Injustice and tyranny become the norm, especially through arbitrary and confiscatory taxation, which Khaldun argues is the death blow to the economy.
The spending continues, but the wealth base is shrinking.
Military and court spending continue to outpace the shrinking wealth base. The ruler tries to raise more money by raising tax rates, which only accelerates the flight of producers. The state loses control of its periphery and is finally easily overthrown by any challenger possessing a fresh, unified, and vigorous Asabia.
And the cycle restarts.
The cycle restarts.
What's so profound here is that this isn't a theological model of divine punishment, it's a sociological prediction. He's arguing that political success is inherently unstable and self-destructive.
He established an iron law. Prosperity leads to luxury. Luxury leads to the softening of character and the dissolution of Asabia. And the destruction of Asabia means the collapse of the coercive power needed to maintain the state. The cycle is inevitable.
So Khaldun's analysis doesn't stop at political mechanics. He integrates the environment into his Ilm al-Umran, which is a remarkable step toward, early environmental sociology. He saw human character as being fundamentally shaped by the physical world.
He did. He adopted a system, which he derived from classical and Islamic geographers, that divides the inhabited world into 7 climate zones, or latitudes, moving from the equator northwards. And this framework wasn't just descriptive, it was analytical.
And his main focus is on what you might call the Goldilocks zone, the balanced climate.
Indeed. He argues that the moderate zones, specifically the 4th and 5th zones, which correspond roughly to the temperate band that includes the Mediterranean, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East, produce the most balanced human characteristics.
Because the climate is moderate.
Yes, which leads to a moderate temperament, intellectual stability, better character, and a greater capacity for complex, advanced civilization. This is where arts and sciences can flourish.
He links climate directly to intellectual capacity and social sophistication.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And he contrasts this with the non-moderate zones, the deep south with its extreme heat and the far north with its extreme cold. Khaldun argues that these extremes influence temperament, often leading to a life where simple survival dominates, limiting the capacity to develop complex social structures or higher sciences.
This environmental determinism then feeds back into his Badawi versus Hadari dichotomy. So how does what you eat or where you live shape your moral fiber?
He makes several specific connections. For instance, he discusses how people living in regions with abundant water and rich farmlands tend to have an easier time providing for themselves.
Which can lead to a certain softness or inertia?
Exactly. They're less spirited, less dynamic, and often lack the fiery independence of those who have to struggle for survival in more arid regions. It's the struggle that preserves the Asabia. The easier life becomes, the softer the morality and character.
The harshness of Badawi life enforces restraint and simplicity out of necessity.
Precisely. Luxury is impossible. Excess is rare. The communal spirit is strong because they have to share and defend each other to survive. Now contrast that with the urban ethical landscape.
In the Hadari setting?
In the city, the pursuit of pleasure is easy. The division of labor, the vastness, the wealth, it all provides endless opportunities for self-indulgence and moral laxity. Khaldun identifies this as the inevitable consequence of security and luxury.
And this moral and social decay is what makes the urban population ripe for conquest by a morally simpler yet structurally stronger Badawi force.
That's the mechanism. And finally, he connects this back to intellectual life. Arts and sciences aren't just cultural ornaments for him, they are contingent measures of a successful umran.
Meaning their luxuries depended on wealth and peace.
Exactly. The flourishing of arts, philosophy, and sciences requires significant resources and a long period of settled stability. Nomadic life, concerned with moving and fighting, has no need or capacity for complex geometry or literary critique. Therefore, when the state enters stage 4 or 5, when the economy declines and instability returns, intellectual life, unable to sustain itself without patronage, inevitably fades.
So intellectual decay is a symptom of political and economic decay.
A direct symptom.
It's time to move to the very sophisticated economic dimension of the Muqaddimah. Khaldun dedicates immense space to the nature of livelihood, or risk, and how wealth is created. This is where he truly sounds like a revolutionary thinker, laying down concepts centuries ahead of his time.
Absolutely. His economic theory is sophisticated because it's completely integrated into his political and sociological framework. He starts by differentiating between the theological understanding of risk sustenance granted by God and the practical economic reality.
And the crucial insight here is the labor theory of value.
The labor theory of value. He states clearly that all wealth and profit ultimately derive from the value of human labor or effort. Amal. Prosperity isn't magic. It requires physical and mental exertion.
The greater the population engaged in productive labor, the greater the wealth of the society.
Right. He notes that the profit a merchant or a craftsman makes is essentially the value added by their labor. So a large industrious population is the actual wealth of a state, not just the gold in the treasury.
Which requires a stable government that lets that labor flourish.
Precisely. Which brings us to his classification of the 4 primary ways people earn their living, which are crucial for understanding the economic complexity of Hadari life.
Okay, let's detail those, starting with the most fundamental.
First, agriculture or farming, ziraat. This is the most essential economic activity because it provides the raw necessities of life. Food. Khaldun sees it as the bedrock upon which all other economic complexity is built.
Second, craft and industry, signet.
These are essential for urban life. Everything from weaving and carpentry to specialized skills like metalworking and medicine, they require specialized knowledge and a sedentary life. They're indicators of a sophisticated civilization.
Third is commerce or trade, tijrat.
Right, the buying, holding, and selling of goods for profit. Khaldun discusses the ethics of commerce, stressing that profits must be moderate. He explicitly condemns monopolistic hoarding, which destabilizes markets and harms the general populace.
And finally, the service sector.
Fourth is service, khidmat. This is working for others, bureaucratic positions, military service, teaching, administration, basically anyone supported by the wealth generated by the other 3 sectors.
And as a state grows larger and more centralized, that service sector, especially government jobs, swells dramatically.
And it consumes ever-increasing portions of the wealth generated by farming and crafts. This expansion of the service sector, specifically government expenditure, is the economic heart of Khaldun's decline theory.
So what's the mechanism of that urban economic decline?
It's a vicious cycle, driven by the ruler's vanity and necessity. As the dynasty progresses into affluence, the expenses for the court, for monuments, and for the enormous loyalty-based military. Remember, the original Asabia is gone, so they have to pay for soldiers. They skyrocket.
So the ruler needs massive constant income. They resort to excessive taxation.
Initially, they just maximize rates while the economy is still vibrant. But as their needs grow, the taxation becomes arbitrary and confiscatory. And Khaldun articulates what economists now call the Laffer curve effect, centuries early.
That when taxation is too high, it stifles the motivation for work.
Exactly. Why work hard if the state is just going to take most of your profit? Excessive and arbitrary taxation diminishes the margin of profit for everyone. People either reduce their productive efforts or abandon commerce entirely and flee the city.
And that shrinking productive base means the total wealth produced in the city falls, which just accelerates the decline.
The state is collecting a larger percentage of a smaller and smaller pie.
Which then leads the state to try to fix the problem by getting into commerce itself. And Khaldun was very critical of government competition with its own citizens.
He saw this as a clear symptom of decline and a guarantee of failure. When the ruler or his officials enter into trade or production, using the coercive power of the state to corner markets, buy cheap, and sell high, they instantly harm the private sector.
Because private merchants can't compete with the ruler.
They can't. He's not subject to the same taxes or regulations. This destroys private incentives. leading to further economic contraction and the collapse of the commercial class.
It seems his economic thought is a warning. A strong state needs a thriving private sector, which can only exist under conditions of moderate, predictable taxation. Once the ruler becomes a predatory businessman, the economic collapse is imminent.
It's a profound political economic linkage. Political stability requires economic justice, and economic justice requires honoring the value of human labor.
Okay, moving from the very practical world of economics to the profoundly intellectual, Khaldun dedicates the vast final section of the Muqaddimah to a comprehensive review of knowledge itself. He catalogs the entire landscape of contemporary intellectual life.
It's an academic deep dive in its own right. He meticulously reviews the various disciplines, which he primarily divides into two major streams.
The first being the religious sciences.
These are the religious sciences, or ulum naqliya, the transmitted sciences. This includes jurisprudence, fiqh, prophetic tradition, hadith, Quranic exegesis, tafsir, and theology. And Khaldun examines the methodologies employed in each.
So even in religious knowledge, he's pushing for critical rationalism to be applied to the human element of transmission.
Absolutely. He sought methodological rigor everywhere. The second stream of knowledge he catalogs are the philosophical and rational sciences.
The ulama kliya, the intellectual sciences, what does this category cover?
It's extensive. Mathematics, including arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, logic or mantic, physics, natural sciences, and metaphysics. He reviews the contributions of Greek and earlier Islamic scholars to these fields, acknowledging their utility.
But his treatment of philosophy and logic is famous for its critical nuance. He wasn't a philosophical purist, but he wasn't an absolute dogmatist either.
He walks a very fine line. He acknowledges that disciplines like logic and mathematics are invaluable tools for sharpening the mind and achieving certainty in measurable, observable domains. He uses logic constantly in his history critiques.
However,
He issues a powerful warning against the overreach of philosophy, especially the Hellenistic tradition, and specifically when it comes to metaphysics.
so he argues that when philosophers try to use rational, logical processes to solve problems reserved for divine revelation, questions of creation, God's nature, ultimate causes, they inevitably fail.
Or worse, they lead to deviations from accepted religious doctrine. Rational thought is bounded by human capacity. Ultimate truths lie beyond that boundary.
So use the intellectual tools, but know their limits. Don't try to logic your way into heaven.
That's a perfect way to put it. His chapter on the criticism of philosophy is meant to fence off the domain of revelation from the domain of reason, ensuring that reason serves revelation, not tries to replace it.
He also spends significant time discussing the spiritual side of intellectual life, Sufism or Tasawwuf.
Yes, he offers a detailed discussion of Sufism, its terminology, and its history. Khaldun views it not as a philosophical or intellectual pursuit, but as an essential practical path, a science of the heart, focused on inner purification and achieving a direct experiential knowledge of the divine.
It's almost a countermeasure to the decadence of stage 5. While the political body decays, the individual can seek spiritual preservation.
It offers a moral foundation that's independent of the corrupt state. It provides a different kind of Asabia, a spiritual cohesion for the individual.
And beyond the content of knowledge, he even gives instruction on how knowledge should be transferred. He gets into specific pedagogy.
This is one of the most practical and insightful sections. He champions the idea of gradual, staged learning. He argued a teacher should introduce general principles simply at first, then revisit the material with more details in a second stage, and only in the third stage should the student be exposed to complex arguments and differences of opinion.
A tiered approach, so the student builds a solid conceptual foundation before getting overwhelmed.
Exactly. He also famously emphasized brevity and clarity, arguing that overly lengthy explanations weary the student and hinder retention. And perhaps most humanely, he strongly warned against the use of harsh discipline or physical punishment in education.
Why was that?
He believed that harshness breaks the student's spirit, instills deceit, and makes them intellectually dull. He saw it as detrimental to their moral and intellectual development. It echoes his broader theory that coercion damages the human spirit, just as coercive rule ruins the state.
And finally, we have to touch on the importance he placed on linguistics, the tool through which all this knowledge is transmitted.
Khaldun dedicated significant space to the Arabic language, to grammar, rhetoric, and the art of poetry. For him, linguistic mastery was absolutely critical, linking it directly to the quality of civilization. He even documents how, as a dynasty matures, the language evolves from its early vigorous form to something more formal, standardized, and less heartfelt, a clear symptom of the overall social decline.
Okay, we've established Khaldun as a revolutionary sociologist and economist. To put his achievement into perspective, let's look forward a few centuries to another giant of political realism who often gets credit for these kinds of concepts, Niccolo Machiavelli. The sources explicitly invite this comparison.
And the parallels are striking, at least in terms of methodology. Both Khaldun, describing the nature of mulk, and Machiavelli, advising his prince, share a core philosophical approach. They analyze political rule pragmatically.
It's grounded in observable human nature and political reality, not abstract morality.
Right. They both understood the fundamental necessity of strength. The successful ruler needs military might, secure wealth, and has to manage the loyalty of his forces and the perception of the populace. They both told rulers what they must do to survive, not what they ought to do to be good.
So if they are both political realists, where does Khaldun transcend Machiavelli and earn the title of the Father of Social Science?
The difference is in scope and explanatory depth. Machiavelli is primarily focused on the executive tactics, how a ruler maintains immediate short-term power within his principality. His focus is on the art of leadership.
Khaldun, on the other hand, is focused on the laws of collective behavior that govern the entire cycle of civilization, the Umran.
Exactly. He provides the sociological physics, while Machiavelli provides the political engineering. Khaldun's theory is macro-historical and predictive. He explains why the state must exist, why it must acquire power via Asabia, and why, regardless of the ruler's skill, the internal sociological and economic pressures mean the dynasty will collapse within a predictable number of generations.
Machiavelli offers strategies for survival. Khaldun offers an explanation of inevitable mortality.
Yes, and Khaldun's unified theory connects economics, environment, demography, and social cohesion, which is something Machiavelli, focused so narrowly on state maintenance, simply never attempted.
That unified approach is why he remains indispensable. He took historical inquiry out of the realm of narrative and into the realm of rigorous predictive science.
He forced political analysis to account for factors far deeper than the actions of individual leaders.
All right, let's synthesize the core insights we've extracted from this deep dive into the Muqaddimah. Let's make sure our listener walks away with the most critical Khaldunian takeaways.
Okay, first, the cyclical nature of political power. All states are subject to a predictable life cycle: birth through strong social bonds, growth through affluence, and inevitable decay through luxury and injustice. This is an iron sociological law, not an accident.
Second, the fundamental importance of social cohesion, of Asabia.
This bond, usually kinship-based and enforced by hardship, is the sole source of political power capable of establishing a state. Its dissipation due to urban luxury is the single greatest cause of dynastic collapse.
And third, the critical balance between vigor and decadence.
The simplicity and courage of the rural population are the necessary foundation for the state. But the subsequent complexity and security of urban life are the predictable causes of moral decay, economic contraction through stifling taxation, and eventual military vulnerability.
It is truly astonishing how much depth is contained in what he called merely an introduction to a larger history. The Muqaddimah is a complete, self-contained body of knowledge that forces us to look beyond immediate political events and see the deep currents of sociological structure.
Khaldun provides us with a framework for understanding the relentless patterns of history. He noted that the political and economic turmoil he experienced across the Maghreb in the 14th century was not random chaos. It was the visible manifestation of predictable, cyclical laws governing human organization.
And if we accept his fundamental premise, that every political structure, regardless of its ideology, is inherently fragile, finite, and subject to these iron laws of cycles, it presents us with a monumental philosophical challenge.
We've seen that prosperity inevitably carries the seeds of its own destruction by weakening the social fabric and corrupting economic principles. So here's the provocative thought we'd like to leave you with, based on Khaldun's enduring insight.
Does accepting the sociological inevitability simply prepare us to manage the decline when it comes? Or does this profound knowledge, the understanding of the mechanism of destruction, offer us the only possible chance, through radical innovation in social and economic structures, to genuinely transcend the cycle for the first time in history?
Something to consider as you watch the rise and fall of political energies and economic booms unfolding today.
Thank you for diving deep into the foundations of social science with us.
We'll see you on the next Deep Dive.